January 14, 1944. 0540 hours. The forests west of Kirovograd sat under a sky that held no color. Snow coated every surface in a heavy sheet that muted sound and crushed every outline into pale sameness. The temperature dropped below -20. Frost crawled across weapon barrels and froze straps stiff against cloth. Soviet rifle companies of the 53rd Army pushed through this terrain and suffered repeated failures in reconnaissance. German pickets watched the tree lines with discipline, and any movement against the white background revealed itself too quickly. Patrols that left before dawn rarely returned intact. The snow reflected moonlight and early dawn light, which exposed the straight lines of white overgarments. Standard camouflage had no texture and no shadow variation. It made men look like moving slabs, not snow. Every failed patrol carried the same flaw. Their uniforms betrayed them before they fired a shot. Corporal Viktor Chernov moved along the shallow depression that served as his platoon's temporary position. He watched two stretcher-bearers drag a wounded scout back toward the aid post. The scout had taken a rifle round through the upper arm. He still whispered through clenched teeth. He kept repeating that the Germans saw them before they even reached the tree line. Viktor listened without speaking. He studied the man's uniform. The white cloth stood out against the surrounding snow because the snow was not clean white. Wind threw grit, ash from burned supply crates and broken pine needles across the surface. The landscape held uneven colors. The uniform did not. Commanders reviewed the problem daily. They issued the same conclusion. The men needed to move slower, reduce noise, and wait for cloud cover. These suggestions did nothing. German sentries used elevation and careful optical scans. They caught the minimal contrast created by clean white fabric against layered snow. Officers blamed poor execution. Sergeants blamed weak discipline. Soldiers blamed bad luck. The truth sat in the open. Their camouflage failed to match real snow. Viktor understood this problem clearly because he learned to see texture before the war. He grew up backstage in a small regional theater. He mixed pigments for fake stone walls, snow backdrops, and weathered surfaces. His eyes learned to detect slight differences in shade. To him, the uniforms looked artificial. They never blended. At 0550 hours, the platoon gathered near a small stove shielded by scrap metal. Frost bit at their faces. The men waited for orders for another reconnaissance push toward a German outpost located beyond a shallow ravine. The lieutenant spoke with calm precision. He stressed caution and silence. No one argued. They all remembered the patrols that went out 2 nights earlier. Only 3 men returned. Viktor kept his hands near the stove for warmth, but his eyes remained fixed on the lantern mounted above it. Soot collected inside the glass and formed a gray film. A small crack near the top let smoke escape. The smoke rose in thin trails and settled on the snow as dark dust. Wind blew across the site. The dust spread and softened into a mottled pattern that matched the surrounding drifts. Viktor crouched and studied it. The pattern broke outlines. It removed uniformity. It looked natural. He wiped a finger across the surface. The residue clung to his glove. It left a faint streak. He pressed it onto a scrap of white cloth. It created a dull gray tint. The cloth no longer looked like a bright patch. It blended more with the surrounding ground. He rubbed more residue across the edges. The fabric took on a texture similar to trampled winter snow. The idea formed in his mind quickly. Lantern ash contained fine particles. Mixed with melting snow, it behaved like a temporary dye. It would not last long, but it could last long enough for a patrol. Viktor stood and stepped toward the lantern to gather more ash. A sergeant frowned at him and asked what he was doing. Viktor explained his observation with simple clarity. The sergeant shook his head. He said the idea sounded foolish. He told Viktor to focus on the briefing. The men nearby laughed quietly. They assumed Viktor wanted to paint uniforms like theater props. Viktor ignored the ridicule. He took a small tin cup from his pack. He scraped the inside of the lantern frame where soot accumulated thick. He mixed the ash with snow until it formed a thin slurry. He dipped a strip of cloth in it. The cloth absorbed the mix unevenly. This unevenness mattered. Pure white surfaces caught the eye. Broken tones vanished. Viktor walked to the lieutenant after the briefing and presented the cloth. The lieutenant asked what he intended. Viktor explained the ash tint idea. He described how the snow surface held shades of gray and brown, not pure white. He said their uniforms needed to match this environment. He offered a simple point. If they moved under moonlight, Germans would see shadows, not bright fabric. The lieutenant listened while glancing across the snow. He had lost too many scouts to ignore a potential improvement. He allowed Victor to test the idea on a single smock. Victor applied the tint by hand. He dabbed it along the seams, around the hood, and across the back. The smock turned into a dirty snow shade. When the soldier wearing it moved a few meters away and crouched near a pine trunk, the men noticed a clear difference. He blended better than any white uniform they had used before. The sergeant who mocked Victor now leaned forward with slow realization. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. He nodded once. He approved a controlled trial. A 4-man reconnaissance team would apply the tint and test it during the night's patrol. If it worked, the platoon would consider broader use. The men gathered more lantern ash. They mixed it with melted snow near the stove until they produced enough slurry to treat several garments. They worked quickly because the temperature stiffened the fabric as soon as they exposed it to cold air. The tinted smocks looked stained and uneven. This unevenness hid them. Victor checked each garment carefully. His years backstage taught him to judge how surfaces appeared under different lighting. Snow moved from blue-gray at dawn to bright white at midday. Camouflage needed mixed tones. Victor ensured the smocks held darker patches near the edges. He focused on the shoulders and the knees. He applied faint streaks where folds created shadows. He did not try to make them look artistic. He wanted distortion. At 0630 hours the tinted patrol prepared to move. They carried standard Mosin Nagant rifles, 1 DP-27 light machine gun, and a small radio set. Their task was simple. Approach the ravine, observe German positions and return with coordinates. No one expected them to engage. They needed invisibility more than firepower. The lieutenant gave final instructions. He told them to keep distance between each man. He told them to move with the terrain, not against it. Victor watched them step into the pale twilight. Their silhouettes broke at the edges. Their shapes did not reflect the first hints of dawn. They disappeared faster than any patrol he had seen that winter. The remaining soldiers returned to their chores. They cleaned rifles. They checked ammunition. They stood watch toward the north. Victor sat near the stove and kept his focus on the snow patterns. He studied every drift, every shadow. He felt no excitement. He felt pressure. If the patrol failed, no one would trust his judgment again. The lieutenant might ban unofficial modifications entirely. He knew the risk. He did not regret it. He believed the idea matched the terrain. He believed this tactic could save lives. January 14, 1944. 0810 hours. A dull light crept across the tree line and revealed the scars of earlier engagements. Shell holes formed shallow basins across the snow. Frozen mud spread along the northern slope where a mortar team had tried to reposition under fire a day earlier. The platoon held position and waited for updates from the reconnaissance team. They listened for the faint crackle of the radio set, but the speaker stayed quiet. Silence created tension. Patrols almost always reported contact or sighting within the first hour. If the enemy did not see them, animals did. If animals did not move, the wind betrayed their location. The forest seldom stayed still. The absence of information unsettled the men, but the lieutenant forced patience. He repeated a single instruction. Halt. Wait for confirmation. Victor reviewed the terrain again. He studied the dips near the ravine where the snow formed alternating blocks of bright white and dull gray. The Germans positioned their pickets along the ridge beyond the ravine. These pickets used layered observation. One man scanned the near tree line. Another watched elevation. A third monitored movement patterns along the flank. German units trained to detect inconsistencies. A clean white silhouette moving across uneven snow fell into that category instantly. Victor had seen it many times. Soldiers who believed they were invisible became targets within seconds. His ash tint solution aimed to break that consistency. If the patrol moved under this pattern, they would appear as shifting shadows. Shadows attracted less attention. At 0830 hours, faint static flickered across the radio. The operator adjusted the gain. A quiet voice cut in. It spoke in controlled Russian. The patrol leader reported clear movement across the ravine. No detection. No incoming fire. No German flares. The men in the listening perimeter exchanged quick looks. This did not happen. Not at that distance. The lieutenant leaned close to the radio and asked for coordinates. The reply came sharp. The patrol had reached within 50 meters of a German sentry post without alerting the enemy. They observed 2 machine gun nests positioned behind frozen logs. They counted 4 riflemen rotating watch in a predictable pattern. They saw supply tracks that indicated heavy movement toward the south road. They reported no enemy reaction to their presence. The lieutenant did not speak for several seconds. He simply nodded and signaled the operator to gather more data. The patrol remained near the enemy outpost for another 20 minutes. They moved along the drifted banks and documented field placements. They confirmed the presence of an ammunition dump partially covered by snow and camouflaged with branches. They mapped trench access points. Each observation carried high risk. Under normal conditions, a patrol would have died attempting this. Visibility exposed them every time. Now the patrol maneuvered without detection. Victor held his breath while listening. He did not celebrate. He wanted confirmation from return movement. If the patrol made it back without casualties, the result would prove the concept. At 0905 hours the radio crackled again. The patrol announced their withdrawal. They moved along a narrow cut between two pines, using the ash tint to blend into shadow pockets. They reported one German sentry glancing toward their position but showing no recognition. No challenge. No rifle shot. The patrol reached the halfway point at 0930 hours. The lieutenant sent 2 riflemen forward to guide them back. When the patrol emerged from the trees, the platoon watched them with disbelief. They approached with steady steps. Their tinted uniforms carried streaks of ash and snow. Their silhouettes looked broken. They resembled the terrain itself. No one spoke until they crossed into friendly ground. The platoon gathered in a tight semicircle around the patrol. The lieutenant asked for casualty count. The patrol leader answered with a tone that carried no pride, only clarity. 0. The men heard the number and remained silent for several seconds. They understood the significance. A patrol had moved deep into contested ground, reached the enemy line, gathered intelligence and returned without a single wounded man. This result had not occurred since the first week of winter. The lieutenant turned toward Victor slowly. He asked how much ash remained. Victor pointed to the lanterns and the stove enclosure. He explained they could generate more as long as fuel lasted. The lieutenant ordered immediate production. At 1010 hours the platoon formed a work detail. Men scraped soot from lantern frames, stove chimneys and burned ration tins. They mixed it with snow until they created enough slurry to stain more uniforms. They worked in silence because the result of the patrol weighed heavily on their minds. They had expected to bury friends. Instead they saw a tactic that kept them alive. Victor directed application patterns. He kept the tint uneven. He darkened elbow folds. He smeared ash along the lower hems. He avoided uniform coverage because it created artificial shapes. He wanted men to blend into patches of broken snow. His stagehand training guided him. On stage, paint created illusions. Here, ash created survival. A messenger arrived from company headquarters at 1040 hours. He requested full reconnaissance notes from the patrol. He also asked for clarification on how the patrol avoided detection. The lieutenant explained the ash tint. The messenger raised an eyebrow but took the information without comment. Higher command did not issue praise easily. They wanted field results, not explanations. The lieutenant provided both. The messenger left toward the command dugout. Victor watched him walk away and wondered if the idea would spread beyond their sector. He did not seek recognition. He wanted fewer wounded men carried past him in the snow. At noon the company received new orders. They would prepare an assault on the southern ridge at first light the next day. The reconnaissance data provided exact positions of enemy machine guns, rifle pits and supply lines. Command wanted another patrol at dusk to confirm movement changes. The lieutenant selected 6 men this time instead of 4. All would use ash-tinted camouflage. Victor spent hours adjusting each garment. He checked shading patterns under different light angles. Clouds moved overhead and created intermittent brightness. He studied how the tint behaved under these changes. The ash absorbed light and reduced glare. This mattered because bright glare exposed movement even when cloth matched the environment. By 1630 hours the second patrol prepared to depart. The first hints of dusk settled across the forest. Shadows lengthened. Snow turned blue-gray. This light exposed flaws in camouflage. Victor stood near the edge of the perimeter and watched each man shift positions. Their silhouettes faded quickly. The lieutenant approached Victor and spoke quietly. He told him the company commander wanted a written description of the tint process. He wanted mixture ratios and application instructions. Not official doctrine but an unofficial method worth recording. Victor nodded. He already planned to write it. He knew soldiers in nearby units faced the same terrain. He wanted them to have a chance at survival. When the second patrol left the perimeter, the forest swallowed them. The men moved along the low ridge with practiced caution. Snow drifted around their legs. Each step produced faint compression sounds that dissipated in the wind. The patrol advanced without attracting attention. The platoon waited again. Waiting tested discipline more than combat. Hours passed in slow tension. The radio operator kept his hands near the controls as if ready to adjust for weak signals. The lieutenant checked his watch repeatedly. The men held their positions and scanned the horizon. At 18:10 hours the radio crackled. The patrol reported contact range of 70 meters with German sentries, still undetected. They confirmed minor repositioning of enemy machine gun nests. They identified new trenches dug along the left flank. They estimated the arrival of resupplied ammunition based on fresh tracks. They reported a clear path for the planned assault. Again no casualties. Again the ash tint worked. The lieutenant closed his eyes for a moment. Relief entered his expression. He signaled the platoon sergeant to prepare the company briefing. The patrol returned at 19:30 hours. Darkness covered the forest. Only lantern light inside the perimeter revealed faces. The men of the patrol carried frost across their eyebrows. Their rifles were cold to the touch. Their uniforms bore streaks of ash and snow. They looked like ghosts returning from a frozen world. Victor inspected the garments. The tint survived better than expected. It clung to the fibers even after hours of movement. Not perfect but enough for infiltration. He made mental notes to adjust the mixture. January 14, 1944. 2015 hours. Temperatures fell again. The cold deepened until breath turned into stiff vapor that clung to scarves and froze into thin crystals. The company gathered in a semicircle around the lieutenant as he relayed instructions for the morning assault. Every detail he shared came from the reconnaissance reports. The location of enemy firing slits. The spacing between the two MG-34 nests. The estimated ammunition reserves. The trench layout along the ridge. All of it possible because two patrols had moved through lethal ground without being detected. The men listened with unusual focus. They no longer wondered whether they would survive a patrol. They now wondered whether they could survive the assault. Winter assaults carried higher risk. Frozen earth resisted entrenching tools. Blood loss accelerated in the cold. Fallen men rarely crawled to safety. Victor understood these factors well. He knew concealment mattered more than ever at dawn when the first burst of light exposed every form on the battlefield. The lieutenant instructed all platoons to apply the ash tint before the assault. He did not declare it mandatory. He simply stated that it worked. That statement held more weight than any formal order. The men started gathering containers immediately. They collected soot from every heating source. They scraped lantern chimneys. They even sifted ash from burned ration boxes. The process became an organized task. Victor supervised teams while they mixed snow and ash into the slurry. He warned them not to oversaturate the mixture. Too much water froze into ice films that cracked under movement. He showed them how to apply the tint in broken patches so no straight line remained visible. The men stained their smocks and helmets with rough strokes. Soon the entire company looked like moving fragments of winter terrain. At 2140 hours, company command called Victor to the dugout. The space was small, built with timber walls and covered in canvas to hold heat. A dim lantern hung from a nail. 3 officers studied a map stretched across a crate. They asked Victor to explain the ash tint again, but this time with precision. He described how snow absorbed a mixture of light wavelengths. He explained that pure white fabric reflected too broadly. This reflection made soldiers visible even at long distances. The ash particles cut that reflection and added uneven absorption. The officers asked whether it would hold during battle movement. Victor answered honestly. It would diminish under constant friction, but it required no special materials. Soldiers could reapply it in minutes as long as they had a heat source in snow. One officer asked why no one had done this before. Victor said most soldiers looked for colors, not textures. Snow was not one color. It shifted every hour. The officers exchanged looks. They dismissed him respectfully. They understood the value even if they did not express it. By midnight the wind picked up. Snow dust drifted in thin sheets that scratched exposed skin. The men tried to sleep in rotations. The ground offered no comfort. The air stung inside the lungs. Soldiers curled into themselves and pressed coats tighter against their bodies. The ash tint dried into the fibers and lost its damp texture. It felt like part of the cloth. Victor lay near a crate and stared at the frost patterns forming along its edges. He listened to the distant rumble of artillery far to the north. Every sound echoed across the frozen forest. He knew the next day would define whether his idea lived or died. If the assault succeeded, the method would spread. If it failed, the idea would vanish like warmth in winter air. January 15, 1944. 0510 hours. The men rose and checked their weapons. Bolt mechanisms froze easily in this cold. The soldiers worked them repeatedly until the steel moved smoothly. They tightened straps and adjusted their tinted smocks. The sky held a faint glow. Dawn approached. Ice cracked under boots as the company formed a staggered line near the ridge. The assault objective sat roughly 700 meters ahead, behind a series of snow drifts and shallow cuts. The two German MG nests guarded the center approach. Rifle pits covered the left and right flanks. German doctrine placed emphasis on overlapping fields of fire. If one position spotted movement, others responded quickly. The company needed to cross the open ground without triggering that reaction. At 0540 hours the assault began. The first platoon advanced in a wide formation. They kept low to reduce detection. Their tinted uniforms blended with the pre-dawn color shift. Snow reflected dull blue light that matched the ash stains. The German sentries scanned the horizon. They remained unaware. The Soviet soldiers moved with steady discipline, pausing at each drift line to check spacing. Victor remained with the support section. He watched the first platoon fade into the terrain. For the first time he felt confidence instead of fear. They no longer appeared as pale silhouettes. They appeared as part of the forest floor. At 0558 hours the first German sentry adjusted his field glasses. He scanned the left sector. Snow gusted near a cluster of low shrubs. The tinted Soviets moved through that zone, but the broken pattern across their uniforms disguised their outlines. The sentry saw movement but registered it as shifting light. He lowered his glasses and continued watching the main approach. The company gained another 40 meters. Machine guns remained silent. No flare cut through the air. The Soviets advanced into a position that would normally trigger immediate contact. At 0612 hours the second platoon joined the push. They carried their DP-27 machine gun low and covered in ash tint as well. Victor moved with them now. His role shifted from observer to direct participant. He carried a standard rifle, but his attention stayed fixed on how the camouflage behaved. He watched the men crawl across a small depression where the wind formed ripple patterns. The tinted uniforms matched these ripples because of their uneven shading. A clean white smock would have glared against the surface. These smocks did not. He felt a quiet surge of certainty. The ash tint gave them a tactical edge they had never possessed in winter fighting. At 0625 hours the German flank sentry lit a cigarette. The ember glowed faintly. He stepped from his post and scanned the ridge again. He remained unaware of the Soviet movement approaching from the south. The Soviets closed within 300 meters. This distance usually placed them in range of early machine gun fire. Not this time. Their concealment reduced detection. They shifted positions in small increments. They kept their weapons low. They avoided creating straight vertical outlines that attracted attention. Victor observed the terrain carefully. He saw where snow drifted thicker along the right cut. He guided two men to use that cover. They moved without drawing a single shot. At 0640 hours the Germans finally detected something. A sentry saw a faint shifting pattern along the left sector. He hesitated. The shape lacked the clean lines of a human form. He raised his rifle and peered down the sights. He focused his vision, but the tinted uniforms distorted the shape. He lowered the weapon. He believed it was wind pushing broken snow. That hesitation saved dozens of Soviet lives. By the time he understood the shape it was too late. At 0646 hours the first Soviet platoon opened fire on the nearest MG-34 nest. Their rounds struck the shield and forced the German gunners to pull back. The second platoon flanked the rifle pits. They fired controlled bursts. German defenders scrambled to respond, but the Soviets had already established positions inside the engagement envelope. The Germans could not direct long-range suppression because they had no clear targets. The ash tint created visual confusion. Shapes moved in and out of shadows. Overlapping fire patterns broke down. Victor fired 2 rounds into a rifle pit. His shots hit the edge of the log wall. The defender ducked. The Soviets advanced through the cut and cleared the position. At 0703 hours the ridge fell silent. The Germans pulled back toward secondary trenches. Their initial positions collapsed under pressure. They had underestimated the threat. Camouflage dictated detection. Detection dictated survival. The Soviets entered the ridge with minimal casualties. Commanders walked the perimeter and inspected the scene. They studied the tinted uniforms and noted how they blended with the landscape. Officers spoke quietly. They understood the tactical shift. Victor stood near the damaged MG-34 nest and examined the snow. His idea had proven effective not only for reconnaissance but for assault movement. He felt no pride. He felt relief. A simple observation saved lives. January 15, 1944. 0735 hours. The smoke of the brief engagement drifted across the ridge in thin columns that twisted in the morning light. The sky brightened, and the snow gained a harsher glare that exposed every shallow indentation in the terrain. Soviet soldiers fortified their new positions immediately. They shoveled snow to build low walls. They reinforced captured rifle pits. They turned the German MG-34 nests toward the secondary German trenches and checked remaining ammunition belts. The air smelled of cordite and frozen pine. The assault succeeded with fewer losses than expected. This result stood out because winter fighting rarely ended without heavy casualties. The lieutenant walked along the line and checked each squad. He paused near Victor and asked whether the tint could be reapplied in the field for continued concealment. Victor nodded. He instructed men to gather ash from burning crates near the center camp and mix it again. At 0800 hours a company messenger arrived with new orders. Higher command wanted the ridge held until armored units moved up. German counterattacks were expected within the next few hours. The ridge offered a clear vantage point over the southern road, and German doctrine favored rapid response to lost positions. The lieutenant ordered all squads to dig deeper and prepare for sustained fire. He scanned the landscape and recognized the importance of concealment. Positions exposed by sunlight would attract immediate artillery adjustment. Victor understood this risk. He instructed the men to darken the forward edges of their positions with ash. This muted the sharp outlines of snow walls and prevented them from appearing as artificial shapes through enemy optics. At 0920 hours the Germans began probing fire. A single rifle shot cracked from the tree line. It struck the snow near the second squad's machine gun. The defenders stayed low. They did not return fire. They waited. The Germans fired again, this time with a cluster of 3 rounds aimed at the center sector. The impacts kicked snow into the air. Victor studied the angle. The shots came from a ridge fold roughly 300 meters away. The Germans were testing for visible silhouettes. They found none. The ash tint and the shadow blending concealed the Soviet positions effectively. After several minutes the Germans stopped firing. They gained no reaction. Their probe failed. At 1015 hours German artillery opened fire. 3 high-explosive shells landed near the left flank. Snow erupted upward and rained down in dense chunks. The Soviet line flattened against the ground. The lieutenant ordered minimal movement. He wanted the enemy to waste shells on uncertain targets. German artillery crews adjusted fire slowly because they lacked confirmed coordinates. Victor watched the smoke plumes rise. He saw how the tinted snow walls absorbed the glare. Normal white snow reflected the fire flash. These tinted surfaces did not. The Germans struggled to distinguish which positions were occupied. At 1042 hours German infantry advanced from the tree line. A small force of roughly 40 men approached in 3 staggered groups. They moved cautiously because they did not understand how the Soviets crossed the open ground earlier. They expected more visibility than they observed. Their field glasses showed fragments of color, but nothing clear. The Soviets allowed them to approach within 200 meters before opening fire. The ash-tinted defenders fired controlled bursts. German soldiers dropped into shallow depressions. They attempted to locate firing positions. They found none. The concealed Soviet soldiers shifted firing angles and created confusion. German squad leaders shouted commands. Their men fired back blindly. At 1105 hours a German NCO advanced toward a small ridge curve and scanned carefully. His rifle barrel glinted. He aimed at what he believed was a Soviet firing slit. He saw a dark patch in the snow wall. He fired twice. The rounds hit a tinted snow formation, not a man. The NCO realized the difficulty. Camouflage altered the fight. He signaled his men to pull back to cover. Machine gun fire from the Soviet second squad forced them to retreat. The German attack stalled. They had no clear targets. The Soviets had all the clarity. At noon the battlefield quieted again. Only scattered rifle shots broke the silence. Soviet soldiers rested in shifts. They checked their weapons for frost. They reapplied ash to their smocks as needed. Victor moved from squad to squad and inspected camouflage patterns. He noted where friction removed tint. He suggested darker patches near the elbows and knees. He advised soldiers to avoid wiping snow off uniforms because clean surfaces created bright contrast. He reminded them to maintain broken lines at the edges of their smocks. His guidance came from years backstage. Stage lights exposed flaws in painted surfaces. Sunlight did the same here. At 1,240 hours, a field courier from battalion headquarters arrived. He carried an order requesting detailed notes on the ash technique. Battalion command wanted a written report for possible distribution to adjacent units. The courier handed Victor a folded paper and 2 sharpened pencils. Victor sat near a log and began writing. He described mixture ratios, application patterns, and reasons behind uneven shading. He explained how natural snow held multiple tones and why straight edges caused detection. He listed situations where the tint would fail, such as heavy snowfall or rapid melting. He kept the guidance practical. Soldiers needed facts, not theory. At 1,400 hours, the Germans launched a larger attack. Mortar rounds landed across the ridge in a slow pattern. Each detonation sent snow outward in violent arcs. Soviet soldiers stayed low. They held their positions and protected their rifles from shrapnel. German infantry advanced behind the barrage. They attempted to flank the ridge from the right. The lieutenant redirected 2 squads to intercept. Victor joined them. They moved across the ridge interior where drifted snow masked their movement. Their tinted smocks absorbed changing light. German observers struggled to pinpoint their approach. At 1,435 hours, contact erupted along the right flank. A German squad pushed through a narrow funnel toward the ridge. The Soviets engaged them at close range. Victor fired from behind a tinted snow wall. The Germans attempted to identify firing points but saw only fragmented movement. Their optics caught no clear shape. The Soviets moved between cover pieces with precision. They used short dashes and immediate drops. The Germans fell back after losing several men. Their attack collapsed under the weight of unseen defenders. At 1,500 hours, the battlefield fell silent again. German troops retreated to the forest edge. They left wounded men in the snow. The Soviets held fire. Ammunition was limited. The lieutenant ordered medical teams to pull wounded Soviets back for treatment. None of the wounded came from exposed positions. Most injuries came from shrapnel during the mortar barrage. Victor helped carry 1 man toward the aid post. The man gripped Victor's coat and whispered that he thought he would die during the assault. Victor told him to save strength. The wounded man looked at Victor's tinted uniform and said it looked strange but kept him alive. Victor gave a short nod. The comment meant more than formal commendation. At 1,610 hours, battalion headquarters sent another courier. The battalion commander requested that Victor report in person once the ridge stabilized. The lieutenant approved the request. Victor prepared to leave but stayed until the next shift secured the line. He wanted to confirm no immediate German push would break through. Once satisfied, he took a rifle and followed the courier down the slope toward the rear command dugout. At 1,700 hours, Victor entered the battalion command post. The interior was warmer than the ridge trenches. Maps covered the walls. Officers moved between tables and relayed information to artillery units. The battalion commander stood near a field stove. He motioned for Victor to approach. He asked Victor to explain the ash tint again with direct language. He wanted to know why it worked better than standard winter camouflage. Victor explained contrast reduction and environmental texture. He said soldiers needed to appear as part of the terrain, not as white shapes. The commander listened without interruption. When Victor finished, the commander said only one thing. The idea would remain unofficial but encouraged. Formal doctrine moved slowly. War demanded speed. At 1,800 hours, Victor left the command post and walked back toward the ridge. Night settled across the forest. Cold intensified. Stars cut through the sky. Victor moved carefully across the snow. He thought of the patrols that returned unharmed. He thought of the assault that succeeded. He thought of the wounded carried past him. He knew the ash tint was not perfect. He knew it would not save every man. But it gave them a chance. A chance mattered in war. January 15, 1944. 1835 hours. The forest darkened into a mass of shifting shadows and faint silhouettes. The ridge line held steady under the weight of the cold. Lanterns burned behind snow walls and cast muted halos that blended into the tinted surfaces. The Soviets maintained strict light discipline. No exposed flames. No reflective surfaces. Victor returned to the forward positions and checked on the men who held the line. Their faces carried fatigue. Their uniforms carried streaks of ash that clung unevenly to cloth fibers. Each soldier understood the importance of these patterns. They no longer questioned the strange stains. They depended on them. At 1900 hours the lieutenant gathered squad leaders for a final briefing. He expected that German forces might attempt a night infiltration. The ridge carried strategic value because it overlooked the southern road and exposed German reinforcement routes. German doctrine sometimes favored small night raids to unsettle defenders before a larger morning assault. The lieutenant instructed all squads to maintain defensive spacing and to avoid unnecessary muzzle flashes. He repeated Victor's guidance. Movement should stay low. Outlines must remain broken. Camouflage needed maintenance. No soldier should allow clean cloth to show. The men listened with quiet seriousness. At 1935 hours the wind changed direction. It blew from the west and carried fine snow grains that cut across the ridge at sharp angles. These grains settled on uniforms and lightened the ash tint. Victor moved down the line to reapply darker patches. He applied ash near shoulders, helmet rims, and lower hems. He reminded each man to check the tint every hour. War did not wait for perfect conditions. They needed to adapt with each shift in weather. His instructions were brief and direct. The men obeyed without argument. Their lives depended on concealment. At 2010 hours faint German voices carried across the trees. The Soviets paused. They listened. The voices drifted and faded with the wind. The lieutenant ordered silence. They expected probing movement. Victor crouched behind a snow wall and scanned the dark shapes ahead. He saw no lanterns. Germans favored darkness for approach. Victor noted how the tinted snow walls appeared under starlight. Their edges did not glow. Their surfaces absorbed the faint sky brightness. He understood why the Germans struggled to see them. He understood why this method worked. At 20:45 hours the first sign of German infiltration appeared. A faint crunch of snow, softer than a footstep, came from the left flank. The Soviet sentry raised his rifle and scanned the shadows. He saw nothing clear. The lieutenant ordered 2 men to shift left without exposing themselves. Victor followed them. They moved through patches of broken snow and drift ridges. Their tinted smocks turned them into indistinct shapes. They advanced 10 meters and stopped. The sound came again. A slow compression. Someone lay in the snow. Germans sometimes crawled forward to locate firing slits. The Soviets held position. They waited. At 2103 hours the German infiltrator rose from a prone position. His silhouette appeared as a clean dark form against the snow. He carried a submachine gun and wore a standard field gray coat without winter overgarments. He misjudged the distance to the Soviet line and exposed himself. The nearest Soviet soldier fired once. The round struck the infiltrator in the chest. He collapsed backward. The Germans retreated immediately. They understood that the Soviets held the ridge with prepared positions. They did not attempt another infiltration. At 2140 hours the ridge settled again into quiet tension. The snow absorbed most sound. Men breathed through scarves to keep the vapor from revealing their position. Victor sat behind a small snow wall and warmed his hands near a lantern placed inside a tin reflector. The lantern produced more soot. He used a piece of cloth to gather the deposits. He placed the soot into a small tin cup for later mixing. He understood that constant maintenance kept the camouflage effective. The men around him accepted this routine. January 16, 1944. 0420 hours. The sky shifted from black to deep blue. Cold intensified. Frost formed along rifle stocks. The lieutenant inspected the line and reminded the men that dawn attacks were common. He wanted every firing position ready before first light. Victor checked the ash tint on helmets and smocks. He added darker streaks where snow had collected overnight. He inspected the snow walls and broke any straight edges with handfuls of loose snow. Even small adjustments mattered under dawn light. At 0500 hours the first German artillery shell landed along the right flank. The blast tore into the snow and sent shards of ice across the trench. The Soviets stayed down. More shells followed, spaced irregularly. The Germans searched for targets. Their lack of visibility forced them to guess. Victor listened to each detonation and tracked which sectors the Germans targeted. Their pattern suggested uncertainty. They lacked precise spotting. The ash-tinted positions remained indistinct even under artillery flash. At 0522 hours German infantry emerged through the tree line again. This time they advanced in strength. Roughly 70 to 80 soldiers moved in a staggered formation. They expected Soviet fire, but the defenders held discipline and waited. The Germans crossed into open snow illuminated by rising light. Their outlines became clear. They searched for movement. They saw none. They advanced another 50 meters. The lieutenant raised his hand. He signaled the first volley. At 0528 hours the Soviets opened fire in coordinated bursts. Rifles cracked. The DP-27 rattled in controlled rhythm. German soldiers dropped and attempted to identify firing positions. They could not. The ash-tinted defenders remained indistinguishable from the tinted snow walls. Germans returned fire based on sound, not sight. Their rounds cut into snow banks and mist. The Soviets shifted angles and created further confusion. At 0541 hours German squad leaders attempted a flanking maneuver. They directed their men to circle toward the left sector. Victor noticed their movement and signaled the lieutenant. The lieutenant repositioned a fire team. They used a depression in the snow to move unseen. Their tinted smocks matched the blue-gray dawn shade. They reached the flank and delivered accurate fire. The Germans retreated from the maneuver and regrouped. At 0555 hours the German attack weakened. Too many of their men fell without understanding where the defenders hid. The Germans pulled back in scattered groups. Their formation broke. Soviet fire continued until the lieutenant ordered ceasefire. He wanted to conserve ammunition. The ridge held. The enemy attack failed again. At 0620 hours quiet returned. The lieutenant walked the line and inspected each position. He assessed damage. Snow walls took shrapnel hits but remained intact. Only minor injuries occurred. Victor checked on the men and reapplied ash where needed. His mixture thinned, but enough soot remained for essential coverage. The men did not question his instructions. They followed them with automatic discipline. They trusted the result. At 0705 hours a messenger from battalion headquarters arrived with a short note. He informed the lieutenant that higher command reviewed Victor's written instructions and found them practical. They would distribute copies to nearby companies by courier. No formal commendation attached. Only a simple directive. Use the method if terrain matched conditions. Victor read the note calmly. He felt no excitement. The acknowledgement meant survival for other units. That was enough. At 0740 hours the company prepared for possible renewed attacks. Snow glare increased as the sun rose above the treeline. Victor adjusted the tint on helmets one more time. The sunlight reflected off clean surfaces easily. Ash prevented this. He applied smudges near the forehead rims and darkened the top folds of smocks. He checked how the tinted surfaces appeared when men moved. They blended with the landscape as intended. At 0830 hours German forces launched one final push. Their infantry advanced behind a smokescreen. The smoke drifted and merged with the morning light. The Soviets held their positions. They used the smoke to maintain concealment instead of losing it. The Germans crossed into open terrain. The Soviets fired at close range and broke their formation. The ridge stayed under Soviet control. At 0915 hours the Germans ended their attempts. They withdrew fully toward deeper forest cover. They did not return. The ridge remained quiet for the first time in 48 hours. Soviet soldiers exhaled slowly. They knew the cost they avoided. Without concealment they would have died crossing open ground. Without concealment they would have died defending the ridge. Victor understood this clearly. His idea did not change the war. It changed a battle. It saved men who would have fallen on white snow for nothing. At 1010 hours the lieutenant ordered a full after-action review. He gathered squad leaders and discussed the ash tint effect. They listed strengths: improved infiltration, reduced detection, better match with snow texture. They listed weaknesses: wear under movement, reduced effect during heavy snowfall, variable performance under direct sunlight. Regardless of limitations, the method worked when they needed it most. At 1100 hours Victor walked the ridge alone. He studied the snow. He studied how the morning light moved across surfaces. He studied the uneven shadows created by wind. He understood that no camouflage was perfect. But perfection was not required. Only advantage. The ash tint created that advantage at a critical moment. January 16, 1944. 1135 hours. The ridge settled into a rare stillness. Broken equipment lay half buried in snow. Empty ammunition tins marked the ground in scattered intervals. The men repaired firing positions and checked wounded comrades who now rested under canvas. Covers near the rear slope. Victor moved between groups and answered questions about the tint. Soldiers wanted to know how long it lasted, how often to reapply it, and how dark the mixture should be under different skies. He gave clear guidance. Thick patches for bright conditions. Lighter patterns for clouded conditions. Always avoid straight lines. Always break edges. The men listened. They trusted the advice because they had seen it work under fire. At 1,200 hours a courier arrived from regimental headquarters. He carried a brief written acknowledgement. It stated that several companies across the sector received instructions on the ash tint method. They adopted it where terrain matched conditions. No formal credit attached. No decoration mentioned. Only a line that said field innovation improves survivability when used with discipline and judgment. Victor accepted the message without reaction. Recognition had never guided his decision. He wanted fewer dead carried across the snow. That goal was simple and remained unchanged. At 1,245 hours the lieutenant approached Victor with a request. He asked him to document the events of the past 48 hours in chronological order for regimental records. He wanted the report to focus on practical results. Reconnaissance success. Assault movement. Defensive concealment. Casualty reduction. Victor agreed. He sat near a half-buried crate, rested a sheet of paper against his knee and began writing. His handwriting remained steady despite the cold. He described the first patrol that vanished into the dawn and returned without a single casualty. He described the assault that depended on concealment rather than speed. He described defensive positions that stayed undetected under artillery flash. He listed the number of German attacks that failed because the enemy could not locate firing points. He did not include emotion. He wrote events as they occurred. At 1,340 hours the sky grew brighter and the wind carried fine powder across the ridge. The men prepared to rotate positions with a fresh company moving up from the rear. Victor packed the remaining ash mixture into a small tin. He planned to leave it for the next platoon. The lieutenant thanked him with a brief nod. It was the only form of recognition he expected. Victor slung his rifle and stepped away from the ridge with the relief group. The path behind him showed the marks of battle, but none of the clean white silhouettes that once doomed patrols. The tinted snow held the memory of what happened. At 1,430 hours Victor followed the column down a frozen track toward the next staging area. He felt no triumph. Only quiet certainty. A small idea changed a single engagement. Men survived because the enemy could not see them. War often rewarded the smallest observations. A soot stain on snow. A broken outline. A shift in texture. These details saved lives long before strategy reached the field.